Imagine getting like a 21.4% raise at your job today.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I take that in a heartbeat.
Right. You get the email from HR, you sign the paperwork, and you immediately start, adjusting your lifestyle.
Upgrading the groceries, maybe looking at a slightly nicer apartment.
Exactly. You mentally spend it. But then you check your bank account at the end of the month, and the math just doesn't add up.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. A massive hidden fee is just being siphoned away before you ever even touch the money. Every single month, a 12.1% deduction just vanishes.
That would be infuriating.
It would be. But here's the crazy part. Over the last 33 years, an entire massive region of the globe received that exact raise.
Yeah, on a macro level.
Right. On paper, their overall development surged by 21.4%. But every single year, a staggering 12.1% of those hard-won gains just evaporates.
Before ever reaching the actual citizens on the ground.
Exactly. And if you're listening to this, you know we love a good mystery on this deep dive. Today, we are tracking down that exact leak.
And the scale of what we're investigating today is just enormous. We're looking at the Europe and Central Asia region.
Which we'll probably just call the ECA, right?
Yeah, the ECA. It's a massive geographical expanse. I mean, it stretches from the western edges of Europe, swarms all the way across the Balkans, through the Caucasus, and deep into the steppes of Central Asia.
So we're talking hundreds of millions of people.
Oh, absolutely. And we're analyzing a really comprehensive data deck from the United Nations Development Program. It spans from 1990 all the way up to 2023.
That's a huge window of time.
It is. And it tracks, life, death, wealth, education. But the core mission of looking at this specific data set is to pierce through this comforting illusion of average numbers.
Because averages can be wildly deceptive.
Highly deceptive. They camouflage some pretty brutal realities on the ground.
So, if you're joining us today, whether you're prepping for an economics briefing or you're just insanely curious about global trends, this deep dive is going to completely reframe how you view human progress.
Yeah, we really want to understand why, when a region mathematically gets 1.6 times richer, the citizens often feel like their slice of the pie is actually shrinking.
Right. Okay, so where do we start with the diagnosis? What's the baseline metric?
The primary diagnostic tool we use is the Human Development Index, the HDI.
Because historically, everyone just used GDP, right? Gross domestic product.
Exactly. For decades, the global standard for success was just how much money does a country generate.
Which is pretty one-dimensional.
Right, because money is really only a means to an end. The HDI was engineered by the UN to measure the end itself. It combines 3 dimensions.
Okay, what are they?
A long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living. It scores a region from 0 to 1.
Got it. 0 is terrible, 1 is perfect.
Exactly. And the ECA region actually has a genuinely remarkable baseline trajectory. Back in 1990, the region sat at what the index classifies as a medium development tier. They had an HDI of 0.674.
Okay, 0.674. So not impoverished, but definitely far from the top tier. Very much middle of the pack globally.
Right. But by 2023, that score had climbed to a really impressive 0.818.
Wow.
Yeah, on a global scale, that puts the region at 69th out of 203 regions and countries. It officially moved from medium to a very high human development classification.
That jump from 0.674 to 0.818, that represents a massive demographic shift. We're talking about entire generations fundamentally altering their life trajectories.
Absolutely.
But looking at the timeline of the data here, specifically the very beginning, the line definitely does not go straight up.
No, it does not.
Between 1990 and 1994, there is this brutal, jagged downward spike. The region's HDI actually drops from 0.674 down to 0.654.
Yeah, it's a severe regression.
What on earth triggers a demographic freefall of that magnitude across half a continent in just 4 years?
Well, that specific 4-year window perfectly captures one of the most volatile geopolitical shifts of the 20th century.
The collapse of the Soviet Union.
Exactly. The fall of the Soviet Union and the disintegration of the broader Eastern Bloc. That data dip from 1990 to 1994, that is the numerical footprint of empires falling and entire economic systems being dismantled literally overnight.
I mean, we always hear the phrase economic shock therapy applied to that era, but what does that actually mean for the math of human development? How does a political collapse drag down life expectancy?
Well, you have to think about the transition from state-planned economies to free market capitalism. It was incredibly violent from an economic standpoint.
So.
In the Soviet system, supply chains were completely integrated and dictated by the state. So a factory in Ukraine might rely entirely on raw materials coming from Siberia,
Right.
and then it would sell its finished goods to a state-mandated buyer in Kazakhstan.
Oh, I see.
So when the Soviet Union dissolved, those borders hardened, the mandates vanished, and those supply chains just evaporated instantaneously. State-owned enterprises were forced into this rapid privatization.
So you have these massive industrial towns where, like, a single factory employs 80% of the population, and suddenly they have zero raw materials and zero buyers.
Exactly. The immediate result was hyperinflation and catastrophic unemployment.
Mm.
And the social safety nets that people relied on, state-provided health care, guaranteed housing, subsidized food, they were abruptly unfunded or entirely eliminated.
That's terrifying.
It was. You could see the devastation starkly in the gross national income per capita.
Right.
The wealth metric for the ECA region dropped from $14,424 in 1990
Down to what?
down to an abysmal $9,575 by 1994.
Wow. The average income dropped by roughly a third in just 48 months. I mean, if that happened in a major modern economy today, it would be apocalyptic. People's life savings, whatever they had in those state banks, completely wiped out by hyperinflation.
And the stress of that economic devastation triggered a massive localized public health crisis. The breakdown of medical infrastructure, the skyrocketing poverty, it actually led to real decreases in life expectancy during that window, especially among working-age populations.
It's a pretty heavy reminder that human development isn't just this guaranteed one-way upward escalator. It's super fragile.
It is deeply reliant on institutional stability.
But the data does show a stabilization. As we cross into the late 1990s and 2000s, that HDI line turns sharply upward. It enters this phase of aggressive growth.
Yeah, once macroeconomic stabilization took hold, and these newly independent states started integrating with global markets, including the expansion of the European Union, the recovery was incredibly robust.
The report breaks this down into three main engines, right? The three wheels of development.
Exactly. Life expectancy, education, and wealth.
Let's dissect those wheels because the recovery numbers are kind of staggering. Over the full 33-year timeline, life expectancy across the ECA jumped from 68.2 years to over 74 years.
Adding nearly 6 extra years of life to an average citizen, it's a monumental triumph for public health and medical access.
And the second wheel, education, shows an equally aggressive jump. The data tracks mean years of schooling for people aged 25 and older.
Right, and that metric rose from 7.4 years in 1990 to 10.7 years by 2023.
Mechanically, that's like taking an entire regional population that used to drop out in middle school and pushing them to finish high school or even vocational training.
It's a massive investment in human capital.
And then there's the third wheel, the economic engine. After recovering from that low point in 1994, the gross national income per capita skyrocketed to $23,171 by 2023.
A huge leap.
But wait, I have to push back on this 23K figure because the graph points up and it's very easy to just applaud that growth. But does an average income of $23,000 actually mean the typical family is living in a warmer house or eating higher quality food?
Well,
Because we know average wealth can be wildly deceptive. Like,
Yep.
if a multi-billionaire walks into a crowded coffee shop, the average wealth of everyone in that room suddenly jumps to hundreds of millions of dollars.
right, mathematically.
But nobody else in that coffee shop can suddenly afford a private jet. The lived reality of the people in the room hasn't changed at all.
And that limitation is exactly why the UN created a more sophisticated diagnostic tool. The basic HDI is great for comparing nations at a high level, but it fundamentally blurs out the extremes.
It hides the billionaires and the people in absolute poverty.
Exactly. It blends them together into this comfortable, smooth middle ground that might not actually exist. To find out what is actually happening in your coffee shop analogy, we have to introduce the IHDI.
The Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
You got it.
So the IHDI is the tool that exposes that 12.1% leak I mentioned at the very beginning. How does the math on this actually work? Is it penalizing the HDI score based on how unfairly the resources are hoarded?
That's a good way to look at it. The mathematical mechanics of the IHDI look at the distribution of achievements across the population. Imagine a theoretical society with perfect equality. Every single citizen lives to the exact same age, gets the exact same days of schooling, and earns the exact same income.
Which is impossible, but okay.
Right. In that impossible scenario, the IHDI would perfectly match the HDI. But because variation always exists, the IHDI acts as a discount rate. The more unequal the distribution of health, education, and wealth, the heavier the discount applied to the region's score.
And when we apply that discount to the ECA region, the drop is pretty severe.
It really is. We take that highly impressive 0.818 score, run it through the inequality filter, and it plummets to 0.719.
And that's where the visual of the report gets stark. It highlights an overall loss of 12.1%.
That is the invisible deduction. 12.1% of the total human development potential is generated on paper, but it's entirely lost inequality before it can improve the median citizen's life.
I always think of it like a municipal water system. The reservoir representing the region's overall GDP is completely full, but the pipes delivering the water to the neighborhoods are compromised. 12% of the water is just leaking into the soil before it ever reaches a kitchen sink.
That's a great analogy. And the most revealing part of this data deck is that we can actually perform a microanatomy of that broken infrastructure.
We can see exactly which pipes are failing.
Exactly. The data isolates the inequality into the three distinct categories. First, inequalities in education cause a 6.6% loss.
Okay, 6.6.
Second, inequalities in health cause an 8.4% loss.
A bit higher, sure.
But the third category dwarfs them both.
Income inequality, and that causes a staggering 20.6% loss.
Right. When you combine and average those distinct leaks, you arrive at the overall 12.1%. But isolating them shows us that income inequality is causing roughly 3 times the developmental damage of education inequality.
That variance is wild to me. Why is the distribution of education relatively stable at a 6% loss, while the distribution of money is so aggressively skewed it causes a 20% loss?
The underlying mechanisms there are really about public policy versus market forces. In the ECA region, you have a deeply entrenched institutional legacy of heavy state intervention in education.
From the Soviet era and European social models.
Yes. There are very robust frameworks for free, compulsory public schooling. The state actively establishes a baseline. Whether a child is born to an affluent family in a capital city or a working-class family in a remote agricultural town, public policy generally mandates they are in a classroom for at least a decade.
So a wealthy family might hire private tutors, but the kid in the rural town is still getting 12 years of structured education. The gap between 12 years of public school and, say, 16 years of elite schooling is relatively narrow.
Exactly. Education has a biological and temporal limit. You can only spend so many years in a classroom. But wealth has no ceiling.
Ah, right. Income is infinite.
In these transitioning economies, income is subject to globalization, privatization, and aggressive capital concentration. Over the last 30 years, the returns on capital money made from owning real estate, holding equity in privatized industries, have grown exponentially faster than the median wage.
So the government has the machinery to guarantee every kid a textbook, but it entirely lacks the mechanisms, or maybe the political will, to ensure those same citizens get a proportionate share of the economic value they generate once they start working.
Exactly. And this creates a highly specific, very volatile sociological friction. The region has cultivated an incredibly educated populace, but you have millions of highly educated citizens pouring into an economy where the wealth is bottlenecked at the very top.
Which is the classic recipe for a brain drain, right? The best talent just emigrates to Western Europe or North America.
Brain drain and deep domestic political resentment.
It makes you think. If you're analyzing a company or a local government, you really need to ask, are you purely measuring top-line revenue growth? Or are you calculating your own local IHDI?
That's the real question.
Because if a company's profits surge by 30%, but the executive suite absorbs 95% of that wealth while the frontline workers get a 2% bump, your organization has a massive inequality leak.
And diagnosing the leak is the only way to realize how inefficient the system has become. But, the mechanisms of inequality aren't restricted to just bank account balances.
No, definitely not.
Some of the most profound bottlenecks are structural and cultural. To truly understand who is being excluded from this growth, we have to look at the gender equation.
Okay, this section of the data is honestly the most deceptive at first glance. If we look at the Gender Development Index, the GDI, the region looks like a total utopia.
It really does. The GDI measures the gap in achievements by comparing the HDI for women directly against the HDI for men. And the ECA region scores a 0.970.
Meaning 1.0 is perfect mathematical parity.
Yes. A 0.970 means the gap in basic capabilities is nearly closed. Out of 194 regions tracked globally, the ECA ranks ninth.
Ninth in the world. That sounds like a massive victory for gender
On
equality.
paper, yes.
But if you actually walk into the executive boardroom of a heavy industry firm in Central Asia or look at the management tiers of a tech company in Eastern Europe, you are absolutely not seeing a 50-50 split of power.
Not at all.
The capabilities might be equal, but the reality isn't. So how does the UN data reconcile that visual reality with a 0.970 score?
It reconciles it by using a second, much more stringent metric, the Gender Inequality Index, or GII.
Okay, what's the difference?
The GDI only measures capabilities. Can a woman read? Is she healthy? Does she have a baseline standard of living? But the GII measures empowerment and structural barriers.
Like what?
It evaluates maternal mortality, the share of seats held in national parliaments, and the labor force participation rate. It doesn't ask what a woman is capable of doing. It asks what happens when she actually tries to apply those capabilities in the real world.
Ah, I see. And the GII data completely exposes the illusion.
It does.
The index score here dropped from 0.446 back in 1998 down to 0.226 in 2023. And with this specific index, a lower score is better, right?
Correct. Lower means less inequality.
So cutting the score nearly in half sounds phenomenal. But here is the catch. Despite reducing their raw inequality score by 50%, the ECA region's global ranking for the GII is completely stuck. They're 59th in the world.
Yep. Stuck at 59.
How is it mathematically possible to improve your raw score by half, but your global rank doesn't move an inch over 2 decades?
Economists refer to this as the treadmill effect. The ECA region is making genuine legislative and cultural progress, but they aren't operating in a vacuum. Global gender norms have undergone a massive revolution since 1998.
Right. Regions like Latin America or parts of East Asia have implemented really aggressive systemic reforms.
Exactly. It's like being on a treadmill set to an 8-minute mile. You're sprinting, you're sweating, you're putting in maximum effort. But when you look at the runners next to you, they're all running an 8-minute mile too.
You haven't gained a single foot of ground relative to the rest of the gym.
Precisely. The global baseline for what constitutes acceptable gender equality shifted drastically. For the ECA region to merely maintain its 59th position, it had to improve by 50% just to avoid falling behind.
Let's dig into the specific paradoxes driving this index, because the contradictions between men and women here are fascinating. Specifically, the intersection of education and mortality. We already established the education gap is functionally non-existent.
Right. The data shows a mere 0.4-year difference in expected years of schooling between men and women. For all practical purposes, boys and girls get the exact same access to public education.
But the life expectancy data tells a much darker story. Women in the ECA region are living to an average of 78.4 years. But men are dying at 71.2 years.
That is a staggering margin. Women are outliving men by 7.2 years.
Why are men dying over 7 years earlier, especially when overall wealth and education are rising? Usually as a region gets richer, the life expectancy gap narrows. It doesn't widen like this. Is it a failure of the medical system?
It's actually less about medical failure and more about sociological and occupational mechanisms. To understand this 7-year gap, we have to analyze behavioral health risks and the labor market realities specifically concentrated among men in these transitioning economies.
Are we talking about the remnants of the Soviet-era reliance on heavy, hazardous industry?
That's a huge component. Across much of this region, the economy still heavily relies on male-dominated, physically punishing sectors. Deep shaft mining, heavy metallurgy, large-scale construction, these carry inherent physical risks that translate directly into higher occupational mortality.
But the hazard doesn't just end when they clock out, right?
No, the deeper mechanism is rooted in cultural psychology, traditional concepts of masculinity.
The deeply ingrained narrative that enduring pain is a sign of strength and going to the doctor is a sign of weakness.
Exactly that. Public health studies across the ECA consistently demonstrate that men utilize preventative medical care at drastically lower rates than women. A man is far more likely to ignore early symptoms of cardiovascular disease or completely skip routine screenings.
So they delay interacting with the healthcare system until a minor issue becomes a fatal emergency.
And when you compound that avoidance with the normalization of severe behavioral health risks, like extremely high rates of alcohol consumption and tobacco use, which are historically tied to male socializing in these cultures, you create a demographic time bomb.
Society is enforcing a toxic standard of stoicism and occupational risk that is literally costing men 7 years of their lives.
It is.
But if society is failing men by driving them into early graves, it is failing women by constructing an invisible cage around their economic potential. We need to look at the power dynamics here.
Yes, this is where the Gender Inequality Index really highlights the bottlenecks. When we evaluate political and economic power, there's a really complex split.
Okay, on the political front, there's undeniable momentum. The share of national parliamentary seats held by women saw a massive surge. In 1990, it was a dismal 5.2%.
Almost entirely male domains.
Right. But by 2023, female representation climbed to 25.97%.
Which is a historical high.
Over a quarter of the lawmakers shaping national policy are now women. It's obviously a long way from a 50-50 balance, but crossing the 25% threshold is a massive institutional shift.
It represents significant progress in political visibility. However, when we pivot from the halls of Parliament to the reality of daily economic independence, that progress just hits a solid wall.
The labor force participation rate.
Exactly. This is the statistic that reveals the true bottleneck. Only 45.7% of women in the ECA region are participating in the formal labor force,
compared to 69.3% of men.
Consider the magnitude of that inefficiency. You have a female population that possesses the exact same level of education as the male population. They're living 7 years longer. They have all the capabilities required by a modern economy.
Yet more than half of them are entirely excluded from formal economic participation. Why does this happen? If a woman spends 15 years in the education system and gets a university degree, why does she just vanish from the workforce? Is it purely a cultural preference?
It is rarely an unburdened, freely made choice. What this 45.7% figure actually reveals is a catastrophic lack of caregiving infrastructure.
Really? Just logistics?
Mostly, yes. In many of these societies, the immense burden of unpaid care, work-raising infants, caring for aging parents, managing the household, is assigned almost exclusively to women by cultural default.
It's like giving someone the keys to a high-performance sports car, their education and capabilities, but telling them they are legally required to tow a 5,000-pound trailer of unpaid domestic labor everywhere they go.
That is exactly what it feels like. When state-sponsored infrastructure for childcare or elder care is either unavailable, broken, or prohibitively expensive, a family has to make a ruthless economic calculation.
And because women often face a systemic gender wage gap in the formal market anyway, the math usually dictates that the woman is the one who has to sever her career to absorb the unpaid labor.
Exactly. So you can run for parliament, and you might even win. But the societal expectation is that you are still primarily responsible for ensuring the kids are watched and the parents are cared for.
The social infrastructure acts as a massive filter, stripping women out of the economy. It's the ultimate inefficiency. You invest billions educating half your population only to construct social barriers that prevent society from reaping the dividends.
It's a huge loss for the region's overall GDP, honestly.
Now, we've spent a lot of time dissecting these systemic leaks and structural failures, but the report isn't entirely a catalog of bottlenecks. There are specific areas where the region has orchestrated massive, undeniable triumphs.
Yes, there are some very bright spots, particularly in Section 4 of our analysis, health triumphs and hidden pockets of poverty.
Let's talk about the public health wins. The UN data presents highly optimistic proof of progress regarding maternal and adolescent health.
The maternal mortality ratio, or MMR, which tracks the number of women who die from pregnancy-related complications per 100,000 live births, the numbers just plummeted.
From what to what?
In 1990, the ratio was 52.5. By 2023, it dropped to 21.2.
That is a decrease of over 60%. We aren't just talking about abstract percentage points. We are talking about tens of thousands of mothers surviving childbirth who a single generation ago would have died.
Absolutely. And the adolescent birth rate mirrors this success. It dropped from 53.9 births per 1,000 young women down to just 19.5.
The mechanics behind that 60% drop in maternal mortality are fascinating because that doesn't just happen organically. It requires intense logistical coordination.
It is hard proof of robust, systemic overhauls to both urban and rural medical infrastructure.
What does that actually look like on the ground? Because it's not just building a concrete clinic and hoping for the best.
No, it requires a fully integrated supply chain of care. It means training and deploying highly skilled midwives to remote areas. It means establishing reliable cold chain logistics, so medications like oxytocin for postpartum hemorrhage remain refrigerated in rural clinics.
And emergency transport systems, right? Reliable ambulances so a complicated delivery in a village can reach a surgical hospital in time.
Exactly. And that corresponding drop in adolescent birth rates points to the widespread availability of family planning, sexual education, and keeping teenage girls enrolled in secondary education.
Because sociologically, the longer a young woman stays in school, the lower the statistical probability of an adolescent pregnancy. It creates a self-reinforcing cycle.
It is a textbook demonstration of how targeted public policy yields generational dividends.
But
There's always a but with this data.
there is. Positioned directly adjacent to this medical triumph is arguably the darkest corner of the entire report. We have to look at the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the MPI.
The MPI. This brings us right back to the danger of averages, because despite the $23,000 average income, despite the new hospitals and the 74-year life expectancy, the MPI exposes a deeply stubborn reality. 1.5% of the ECA population remains trapped in absolute multidimensional poverty. We should define what multidimensional poverty entails, because it's vastly different from just standard income poverty. The MPI doesn't just look at a bank account. It measures overlapping, simultaneous deprivations.
Like what?
It evaluates whether a household has access to clean drinking water, reliable electricity, adequate nutrition, basic sanitation, a floor that isn't made of dirt, and whether any child in the home is attending school.
So to be captured in that 1.5% means you aren't just struggling to pay a bill, you are entirely disconnected from the basic infrastructure of the 21st century.
Yes. And the data reveals that this 1.5% suffers from a deprivation intensity of 37.1%.
Break down the mechanics of that 37% intensity. What does a random Tuesday look like for a family experiencing that?
It means that out of all the possible infrastructural deprivations the index tracks, this family is simultaneously experiencing over a third of them every single day. Their child is likely out of school to fetch water. They're cooking meals inside a poorly ventilated home using solid fuels like wood or dung, which creates severe respiratory hazards. They lack an indoor toilet. They have no access to a power grid.
Their poverty is an inescapable physical cage.
Exactly.
It is the equivalent of living in a hyper-modern smart city where your neighbors are driving EVs and using 5G networks, but your specific neighborhood on the edge of town is completely severed from the power grid, lacks running water, and has no schools. You are functionally invisible to the broader macroeconomic success happening just a few miles away.
And solving this demands a fundamental shift in how governments approach development. For the past 30 years, the dominant strategy has been flood economics.
The idea that a rising tide lifts all boats.
Right. Grow the GDP, deregulate markets, raise the HDI average, and the wealth will eventually wash over everyone.
But the flood didn't reach everyone. The water pooled at the top.
It lifted millions out of standard poverty, which is great, but the era of flood economics is mathematically over. This final 1.5% is structurally excluded. A 5% bump in the stock market will never impact a family cooking with solid fuel on a dirt floor.
Because they're too geographically isolated, or maybe they belong to marginalized ethnic minorities facing systemic discrimination.
Exactly. So policymakers have to transition from flood economics to a strategy of precision drip irrigation.
Precision drip irrigation, I like that.
You cannot cure a highly localized infection by just feeding the patient more calories. You need a targeted antibiotic.
Oh, man.
Governments must identify these invisible neighborhoods, physically run the power lines to those exact coordinates, and dismantle the specific cultural barriers keeping them isolated.
It requires acknowledging that the easy, broad strokes work of development is finished, the low-hanging fruit is gone. Now it's the grueling, expensive, highly localized work. But this raises a really difficult logistical question. If bringing that final 1.5% out of poverty requires building more physical roads, laying more copper wiring, and pouring more concrete, what is the ecological bill for all that construction? Because progress requires raw materials.
And that exact tension is the focus of the final major section of our analysis, the cost of prosperity and the earth pressures. To understand this, we use the PHDI.
The Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index. This is the metric where the UN forces a region to look at the ecological receipt for its growth.
Exactly. Because acquiring a $23,000 income means you are consuming more, buying more fast fashion, eating more meat, buying electronics.
So what is the actual environmental toll of the ECA's development?
The data reveals a deeply complex sustainability paradox. Let's look at the positive trend first. Carbon dioxide emissions per capita across the region dropped significantly. In 1990, the region emitted 7.7 tons of CO2 per person. By 2023, that fell to 5.03 tons.
On the surface, that sounds like the ultimate victory for climate policy. Cutting per capita carbon emissions by a third, while wealth and life expectancy skyrocket. Decoupling economic growth from carbon emissions is the holy grail.
It appears to be a massive victory. But then we look at the second metric, the material footprint per capita.
What does that measure?
It measures the total physical volume of raw materials, biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, that must be extracted from the earth to meet the final consumption demands of the citizens. And that footprint exploded.
Exploded to what?
It grew from 8.4 tons per capita in 1992 all the way up to 13.32 tons by 2023.
Wait, hold on. 13 tons?
Yeah, over 13 tons of the Earth's physical crust per person every single year.
But how does that work? How is it physically possible for carbon emissions to drop by a third while material extraction surges by 60%?
The mechanism driving this is known as outsourced emissions, and it completely shatters the illusion of regional greening. The ECA region underwent a massive structural transition over the last 30 years. In 1990, they operated heavy, highly polluting, inefficient industrial manufacturing economies. They mined their own coal and smelted their own steel.
And as they integrated with global markets, those local dirty factories were shuttered.
Exactly. They transitioned into consumer and service-based economies. They're consuming more physical products than ever before, but they are importing their smartphones from massive manufacturing hubs in East Asia. They are buying fast fashion produced in South Asian textile mills.
Oh, I see. So the immense cloud of carbon emissions required to smelt the aluminum for that smartphone is officially logged on the balance sheet of the manufacturing country.
Precisely. It doesn't show up in the ECA's 5 tons of CO2.
Yeah.
But the material footprint, the actual raw ore ripped out of the ground, is mathematically assigned to the final consumer.
That is a profound accounting trick. The region cleaned up its own local environment by effectively paying nations halfway across the globe to absorb the ecological damage of its consumption.
Yep. They achieved very high human development, but they are sustaining it by extracting massive volumes of resources from the broader planet.
But this leads to the most mind-bending statistical anomaly in the entire UN data deck. Let's look at the global rankings. In the standard HDI, the ECA region ranks 69th in the world.
Right.
But when you apply this planetary pressures adjusted index, when you actually penalize the region for chewing up 13 tons of Earth per person, their global ranking doesn't fall. It jumps 24 spots. They move from 69th globally up to 45th in the PHDI.
It's entirely counterintuitive. You'd assume factoring in environmental damage would cause a highly developed region to plummet down the leaderboard.
How does the UN math reward them for a massive material footprint?
It requires us to understand comparative data. The ECA region doesn't jump 24 spots because it's an absolute environmental utopia. 13 tons per person is entirely unsustainable. But rankings are a zero-sum game. To understand the jump, you have to look at the nations that normally rank above the ECA.
You mean the ultra-rich, hyper-developed nations? North America, Western Europe?
Exactly. When you analyze those extremely high-income regions, their ecological debt is astronomical. An average citizen in North America might carry a material footprint exceeding 20 or even 25 tons per capita.
Wow.
So when the UN applies the planetary pressure discount rate to every country simultaneously, the ultra-rich nations suffer a catastrophic collapse in their scores. Their ecological penalties are so massive that they plummet down the rankings. The ECA region is penalized too, but because their footprint is relatively lighter than the hyper-consumers above them, they leapfrog 24 countries on the way down.
That is fascinating. The ECA isn't perfectly sustainable, but they are dramatically more sustainable per unit of human development than the richest countries on Earth. They've inadvertently engineered a society that provides a modern life. 74 years of life, 11 years of schooling, 23,000 income, without completely maximizing the destruction of the planet to the apocalyptic degree seen elsewhere.
And that relative efficiency positions the ECA region as a potential global blueprint. If policymakers there can aggressively invest in true circular economies, reducing that footprint, building recycling infrastructures, deploying renewable energy grids, they could become the first region to achieve elite human development with a genuinely sustainable planetary footprint.
Which brings us to the end of this incredibly dense, revealing journey through the data. If we could paint one final conceptual visual for you, whether you're listening at home or on your commute, imagine a massive set of scales, a precarious balancing act. On one side of the scale, you have the sheer weight of human development, the income, the life expectancy, the public education. It sits at a hefty, impressive 0.818 score.
But on the other side of the scale, you have the gravity of sustainability and equality, the crushing weight of a 13-ton material footprint, and the severe drag of that 12.1% overall loss to inequality.
We started by analyzing a steady 21.4% growth over 3 decades, watching a region pull itself out of the brutal economic shock of the early 1990s.
We then dismantled that growth to expose the efficiency leak driven heavily by a 20.6% income disparity.
We unpacked the deep paradoxes of gender progress, a historic surge in female political representation to 25.97%, but paired with a structural lack of caregiving infrastructure that keeps women out of the labor force, and that toxic cultural stoicism driving men into early graves by a margin of 7.2 years.
We celebrated a massive reduction in maternal mortality, only to realize that 1.5% of the population remains trapped in multidimensional poverty, requiring precision interventions.
And finally, we decoded the environmental accounting trick of outsourced emissions. The metrics we unpacked today, the HDI, the IHDI, the GII, the MPI, the PHDI, these are not just academic acronyms.
They are vital diagnostic tools, designed to force us out of our complacency and confront the structural realities of how we build our societies.
So why does all this matter to you? Because true development isn't just the accumulation of raw numbers on a spreadsheet. It is the equitable, sustainable reality of prosperity reaching every single citizen. It's ensuring that the power generated by the grid actually turns on the lights in every home. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final brand new puzzle to consider, building on everything we've just discussed about the ECA region's transitioning economy. We've talked extensively about the 12.1% inequality leak driven by wealth concentrating at the top, while millions of highly educated citizens struggle to find their fair share of the market.
Right.
Look at the horizon. We are currently standing on the edge of the artificial intelligence revolution. AI is specifically engineered to automate and optimize the exact administrative, analytical, and service sector jobs that millions of citizens in the ECA region transitioned into after their heavy industries collapsed in the 1990s.
That is a massive paradigm shift.
As AI begins to deploy across this highly educated, highly vulnerable labor market, what happens to that invisible 12.1% leak? Does AI become a tool that democratizes productivity and finally patches the broken pipes of wealth distribution? Or does it act as the ultimate catalyst for capital concentration, turning that 12% leak into an unstoppable 30% flood, hollowing out the middle class entirely?
That is the defining question for the next decade of data.
The next time you read a headline celebrating record-breaking economic growth, I challenge you to look past the average. Look for the leak. Because the real story of human progress is never found in the middle. It is always found in the margins. Until next time, keep diving deep.